This is Werner Eys with a brief explanation on the principle of legality and its importance in matters of taxation. For the purposes of this presentation, three questions are posed, namely, what is generally understood as the principle of legality, to whom it applies, and when would the principle or doctrine apply. To answer these questions, let us view the principle through the eyes of authors on the subject and through the lenses of the judiciary. What is generally understood as the principle of legality? According to Dijsselhouse, Hunt and Taggart, in the context of administrative law, the principle of legality is part of a culture of justification in which decision makers must justify their decisions. In terms of the criminal law, Snyman describes the principle of legality as a mechanism to ensure that the state, its organs and its officials do not consider themselves to be above the law in the exercise of their functions but remain subject to it. To whom does the principle apply? The principle of legality has therefore at its core the requirement for decision makers to act within the scope of their authority and to justify their decisions. Importantly, the South African Revenue Service, SARS, as an organ of state, is bound by the processes and procedures prescribed in tax legislation. Does the principle of legality also apply to the highest executive powers of government? Yes. According to the High Court in Moyane v. Ramaphosa and others, at paragraph 33, the executive powers of the President of South Africa can only be constrained through the principle of legality and rationality. Therefore, there can be no doubt that an executive decision must be rationally related to the purpose for which the power was given. Does the principle of legality apply to tax legislation? In Pienaar Brothers Pty Limited versus Commissioner for the South African Revenue Service and another, the High Court stated that the principle of legality requires that law must be certain, clear and stable. Thus, there can be no vagueness in legislation. In this matter, the crux of the taxpayer's complaint was about the constitutionality of a retrospective tax amendment insofar such an amendment offended the principle of legality and the rule of law, which lie at the heart of the South African constitutional dispensation. According to the High Court, the tax amendment adopted by Parliament was not considered to be arbitrary, but was reasonable and justifiable. Taxpayers were given sufficient notice by government of the future enactment of the amendment to close a tax loophole. Nevertheless, the retrospective nature of legislation will remain a topic for debate. Is the principle of legality constitutional? The Constitutional Court in Fetcher Life Assurance Limited and others versus Greater Johannesburg Transitional Metropolitan Council and others answered this question and for the first time by a constitutional court referred to the principle of legality as a constitutional principle. This is important as the interim constitution of South Africa was adopted in 1993. Thus, the principle of legality is also implicit in the Constitution of South Africa in 1996. According to the Constitutional Court in Fetcher, it seems central to the conception of our constitutional order that the legislature and executive in every sphere are constrained by the principle of legality, as public officials may not exercise any powers nor perform functions that are beyond the authority bestowed upon them by law. When does the principle of legality apply? Here are a few examples. In criminal law, the principle of legality will apply to the alleged conduct of the alleged offender to determine whether the conduct is recognized as a crime by law. Although not all decisions are reviewable under the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act or PAJA, if applicable, PAJA must first be disposed of. For example, in Carte Blanche Marketing CC and others versus Commissioner for the South African Revenue Service, the High Court noted that it was up to the taxpayer whether to challenge the legality of SARS selecting the taxpayer for an audit. On the one hand, any challenge by a taxpayer must be ripe for hearing. If SARS, for instance, selected a taxpayer for an audit and the process has not been finalized, the timing of an application to review SARS's action in court is important, as an audit is merely the start of an investigation into the taxpayer's affairs without any final determination having been made, such as raising an additional assessment. On the other hand, in ITC 1921, the tax court held that SARS breached the principle of legality when it failed to ensure the validity of its audit process of the taxpayer's tax affairs. The court also set aside the additional assessment raised by SARS for not informing the taxpayer of the audit and by not providing the taxpayer with written reasons within 21 business days of raising the assessment. In Reed versus Minister of Finance and others, the taxpayer challenged the decision of SARS to disallow his application for relief from SARS in terms of the voluntary disclosure program under the Tax Administration Act. The taxpayer's view was based on SARS's irrationality of decision. SARS had to determine a fact. Was the disclosure voluntary or not? Ordinarily, such a determination would be immune from a review unless it was a jurisdictional fact. The court held that an official can only be blamed for irrationality if he or she makes a mistake in his or her interpretation of the legislation in question. This was not the case. The court upheld SARS's inquiry into the facts surrounding the taxpayer's disclosure, that it was not voluntary, and concluded that this case was not about the exercise of a discretion or review of an administrative decision, but about the judicial review of the factual findings of an administrator. We have come to the end of this presentation. As Deisenhouse, Hunt and Taggart submitted, the principle of legality, in essence, should inspire a culture of justification. Thank you for watching.